Welcome to an interaction with a well-known scholar of media literacy, Dr. Belinha De Abreu. Dr. De Abreu is a professor at Sacred Heart University in Connecticut, and she holds a Ph.D. in curriculum and instruction with a media literacy focus, actually, from the University of Connecticut. She's an award-winning researcher and the author of 13 books on media literacy and related pedagogical areas. A recent edited book from Routledge is called Media Literacy, Equity, and Justice. Dr. De Abreu is a respected expert in media literacy, having served as an international expert to the Forum on Media and Information Literacy for UNESCO's Communication and Information section. She's also interested in a variety of areas or subjects, including privacy and big data, critical thinking, edtech, and teacher training. She is the president of the International Council for Media Literacy, which was earlier known as the National Telemedia Council, which is the first media literacy organization in the United States. But recently, Dr. De Abreu and her colleagues at the council have felt the need to make media literacy a worldwide movement, and the new name of the council reflects that philosophy. So, thank you for taking the time, Belinha. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Sure. We're used to seeing media literacy as a pedagogical kind of a movement, not necessarily a cultural movement, right? Like, and your book actually prompted these thoughts. It brings me to my first question. Why do you see the need for media literacy to have a wide, or at least a wider, geographic canvas? And therefore, do you see a cultural value in media literacy?
Well, I think they're both interchanged in one way or another, because we can't talk about media without looking at it from a cultural standpoint. And because media is a part of our culture and it influences our culture in one way or another, they sort of coexist without necessarily always being called out for that piece. And the reality is that I believe that media literacy is global, and its context must include different cultures, different beliefs, different perspectives, and also hold a respectful understanding that we all don't see media or the influences of media in the same way. So it really is synonymous and not really a separate entity. And I think we've always talked about it in that particular way, just because of how we approach media literacy, which, you know, can be from an educational standpoint, somebody from the community or so forth. I think it all depends on how you look at it. The other thing too is that we live in a world where technology has placed us on the global frontier. We are here with our counterparts every single day from wherever they are around the world. And it breeds a necessity for understanding. And it also breeds a necessity for continued dialogue so that we can actually have discourse about the different types of things that we see within the media. And
the council then takes kind of advantage of this technological opportunity that there is, right? Like, is that fair to say that now it is almost incomplete to think of media literacy as something that's cocooned within our community or our school or college or whatever, in our context? And to be able to compare and contrast other contexts is also part of media literacy then?
Well, I think, like, to be fair, I would think it's important to know that even though it was called the National Telemedia Council before we switched the name, it always had a global countenance. The journal itself, the Journal of Media Literacy, always was something that was sourced through our Canadian counterparts, our UK counterparts, our researchers in different areas. So we always had that piece. Oftentimes, there was always this kind of combination of work happening, but it wasn't officially implicitly put into the name. And so one of the things that we wanted to do was to make sure it was there, and then in turn make sure that our board was reflective of people from all over the world. And that doesn't, you know, it's interesting because we live in a time where, you know, representation is a big deal, and it's 100% a big deal. But global representation isn't always the same as sometimes cultural representation, or
Certainly
even
media representation.
right, exactly. So I think it's important to note that, because we are being really reflective about, the people that we want on the board, and certainly we want to make sure this work that we do reaches every community everywhere around the world, and that has always been true from the onset.
Right. In your introduction to that new edited book that you have, Media Literacy,
Sure.
Equity, and Justice, and you've
Right.
been a proponent of media literacy juxtaposed with justice for a long time, haven't you? Because a lot of your books actually reflect that. But your introduction in this book is interestingly titled Shaping Dialogue Amid Broken Conversations. First of all, let me understand what you mean by that title.
Well, we live in a time where people don't talk to each other. We live in a time where, we tend to not listen, and the dialogue is very strained. And what I often find is that people have reactionary responses to the things that are happening around the world, and that's acceptable to a certain degree. But if you're looking for depth, and if you're looking for an openness and a way, an entry point for more dialogue to foster, that reactionary response is not usually the place where we want to stay. I'm
Right.
looking for people to be reflective and to be thoughtful, and to really think about, the messaging that we're receiving, the way it's being told to us, and to understand that there's more than one point of view. And even though people in this field will say, oh yes, this point of view, we talk about it, we talk about it as part of media literacy key questions and so forth, what I often find is that the point of view that people want is their own, and not necessarily the point of view of the other. And I really wanted to make sure that this book, and perhaps in my chapter as well, it kind of brings about that tension. We are at a place where we are fighting against each other in an odd way. We have dialogues with people that I'm surprised sometimes, because I think of them as media literate, only to find that perhaps the media literacy piece only reaches a certain level, and the leveling up that I'm expecting is missing. And that may be due to many factors, but the end result is that we're living with broken conversations.
Sure.
And so that kind of brings it full circle.
Right. And those conversations also actually segue back into the first thing that we talked about, which was how it is cultural, and therefore it has to be, these conflicts and tensions have to be necessarily part of those conversations. So anyway, in your introduction, you write, quote, cancel culture and censorship have become synonymous. And while some groups have said that this is about holding people accountable, others have said it limits an opportunity for people to see that the world often lives in the in-betweens. More important are the missing voices of people who haven't had the opportunity to take part in the cultural dialogue. This fracture has led to college students asking for cultural safe places, which has also led to the breakdown and divide in discourse and critical thought, resulting in many canceled lectures, comedians refusing invitations, and protests. Somehow this all, I come from India, all this is so familiar to me, and therefore, sometimes even decontextualizing certain things actually makes sense. So in any case, so this is on page 3. In other words, what it means to me is that we need more people to be authors of new texts, but in a dialogic way that this new technology anyway is allowing. But it would seem from what you're arguing that the space for that kind of dialogic authorship is actually shrinking. And that would sound paradoxical to me, given so much that the technology should actually enable. So are you, like Elon Musk, an advocate of absolute free speech here? And what is that nuance we're missing in this tussle between free speech and the cancel culture?
Well, I think
I'm sorry, it seems I had to bring it up because apparently free speech is always pitted against cancel culture for some reason.
So I think that the issue really is that there's this assumption that because we have this technology and everybody has access, which is not true, by the way, that we also have access to ideas and cross ideas and different opinions and so forth. And I think that kind of breaks it down to what we actually have and what our algorithm allows us to see and what the algorithm believes we want to see and so forth. And so what I find that is structurally disappointing in many ways is a lot of repeated thought that doesn't allow for much differences or nuances. And I actually speak a lot about nuance lately because I think that's gotten lost along the way. We take that from just the technology. If we look even at our news medium, we don't have much differences, even though, we'll say, oh, CNN is right and Fox is left and the whole thing. But the reality is, if across the board, if we were to watch the things happening in front of our screens, much of what is being said is the same. It's just got a little bit of a twist. So there's not this differentiating voice. There's not the other person who's sitting there going, I don't know if I really believe either one of you right now. Or maybe I have some other contradictory thoughts to what's actually being said. And that is something that we really need in the conversation, but is completely missing. And I know, there's a lot. It's funny, today I was listening to a radio show called Smerconish that's on Sirius Radio, and he was talking about ranking and voting and so forth. And many times I've heard him talk about different kinds of things in regards to, the political system here in the United States. And interesting comparing that to something that's happening in Australia that's been happening for a number of years, where they always have done ranking. But I think what it really comes down to, and what I find more fascinating, is this idea that the reason why people want rank is because they don't see where their vote is. And so it's actually missing in the dialogue, which I think if you were to ask the majority or the greater majority, I would say, of people in the US, they would tell you that they are not being represented. And so the factions, I should say, they are the ones that have, obfuscated with the media. And we all live within that, hoping that we can kind of push through some of the ideas that we think are really valuable and important.
Right. So therefore, there has to be a moderation, you would say, between something absolute and something that is absolutely the other thing. And always the truth is going to lie in the middle. And actually the consumer, the media consumer, seems to understand that, except that their representatives and their narratives don't give them enough space to tell them that you're actually right. This is where the actual dialogue should be, in the space that you guys are. But we're not allowing that, and somehow that then becomes a media literacy problem, right?
Yeah, I think what we actually have in fact is a literacy problem, to use actually something that you speak of very often, Shashi, which is that we don't have people who are literate in many different ways. And for me, that's the biggest piece of it, is media literacy. And I was just reading an article today that kind of disputes the whole media literacy thing, but talks about it in terms of literacy per se. Well, sure, if we were to go down the rabbit hole of literacy, let's talk about reading and writing and what we're missing, and then move our way through it. But I think when we look at things like information literacy, computer literacy, science literacy, it's all about the same thing. How do we see the information, understand it, decode it, perceive it, construct it, you name it? Is there bias? Is there not bias? Like, there's a million questions to ask in between, but you have to know to ask the question. And I think that's the part that I feel is lacking, in that the questions that are being asked are not the ones that are most needed. And so unfortunately, the responses that we get end up being sort of the middle of the road, and I don't even know if I want to say middle of the road. I actually think they're very extreme, because they don't represent the middle of the road.
That's
Instead, they represent the outer edges. And I think that's hugely problematic.
That again takes us back to the whole McLuhanian idea of technology and so on. Because in this age, you would expect that people would be more comfortable self-representing, because if the representation is not doing what they think they're doing, are we in that transition where the authors of their own texts are us, and therefore we don't necessarily have to trust these extreme representations, but we would rather trust communities around us, but then that also builds echo chambers and filter bubbles.
Yeah,
right?
I think,
so.
yeah. I guess my problem, right. I mean, I agree. But I also think the problem is that even within your echo chamber and your filter bubble, whatever it may be, it's always this small group of people, right? And it's usually the one with the loudest voice gets heard. And I think that's what we're seeing right now, is that the person with the loudest voice is the one that's plummeting through, our mediums, through our internet, through our social media, through TikTok, you name it. I think the self-representation piece, which you're talking about, has been afforded by such things like TikTok and Twitter. And I'm not sure, I think that's it's an interesting test of humanity, because by the same token, we haven't seen the best of humanity in some of these spaces. We've seen some are really problematic places and spaces and words and dialogue happening there, which also is not reflective of the greater. So that, I think it's there's so many things when you look at, how we ended up here, and this idea that technology was going to solve the world's problems. And I think what it did do is open a doorway. And for a while there, that doorway kind of glistened, it was like the hope of the future. And then it turned. And some people say, oh, it's because people made it the way it is. Of course, that's true. But I think the opportunity for it to be pushed into certain parameters and spaces because of the algorithm, because of how we want to market things. Because none of this, as benevolent as it sounds, like, oh yes, we have the internet, it's free, it's wonderful. It's not free. We all know it to not be free, and that's the first fallacy of this idea of the communications and the technology, is that in its benevolent roots, it became not so benevolent. So I think it's kind of put us in this space, because now we have this, if you talk to people, they'll say we can't live without it, and yet we can't really live well with it either.
Yeah. And you would think that technology is actually a representative, but sometimes it's not. So on to the solution side of things, the downstream, I call it. One of the chapters in your book talks about something that I found fascinating, which is immersive media literacy. And then the authors, Wang, Parrish, and Castaway, they talk about social justice activism as juxtaposed with immersive media literacy. They point out some positive aspects of what social media can do with algorithms and so on and so forth, like the VR, the virtual reality technology, they say can foster empathy. Do you believe that as users of technology, consumers of media texts, and therefore producers of media texts, we're prosumers of media texts, there is an opportunity for us to be more ethical, especially as citizens. And when I say opportunity, we've looked at this gloomy kind of tendency of what technology is doing to us, of what representation is doing to us. Where is that opportunity? Does it lie here?
So it's a really great question. I think it's one that is still developing. I don't know. I'd like to think that there's a possibility within virtual reality, or in the immersive media literacy piece. I don't know. And that's my honest answer, because virtual reality has been.
That's because nobody knows.
Nobody knows, but I also, well, I don't know about that. Maybe somebody knows, just not me. But I do think, look, the reality is in 1989, when I was an undergraduate, my senior seminar was on virtual reality. And I find it really funny that the virtual reality that we talk about now, which is, 25, 30 years later, we're still talking about virtual reality as this possibility. I just wonder how many of us are ready to step over into that immersive space. And I do think, I certainly think there's a segment of the population that 100% wants to be in virtual reality, in these spaces where they could see the world in a better light. But let me just say that, one of the immersive technology pieces that I got a chance to play around with for a while was Second Life. I don't know if you remember. And even in that space, there were problems. And it became very, very problematic, in fact, to be in that space, as a woman, as someone who, wasn't aware sometimes of the things that were happening, and or even understanding the code of conduct within these spaces. And I think that's another part of this that definitely needs to be addressed. What I really like and I appreciate about the Wang, Parrish, and Castonguay article is that it's like this possibility, this hope of where it could possibly go and the potential of where it could go. And I think I have to leave it with that, because I don't know.
Yeah, well, and it's also an example of gamification, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, can we adopt gamification as a means of media literacy,
Right.
or self-taught media literacy, maybe? So
Right.
that, like you say, we should leave it at the possibilities of that.
Sure.
But onto a larger question, Belinha.
Sure.
Why is truth important in an age that invites falsehood, and everyone recognizes it? The law recognizes it, and law gives you the opportunity to lie
Sure.
without going to jail for it. But it seems, so for example, lying is allowed, but somehow we are trying to fix bias. Is there a world without bias? Are we looking at truth the wrong way?
The thing about truth is that I feel like this is one of those things that takes us to a personal level. Truth is innately something that we want from people. We expect on the other side. When we get into a relationship with someone, when we start friendships, when we're, with our significant others, the basis of truth is the bond that creates the relationship. I think that's part of why this issue about truth has become so problematic. Because now we're stepping into areas where we assumed people wanted truth. And what we realized is that
That's right.
People want falsehoods as well, because it helps them to get the society that they want, or the group that they want to follow them, and so forth. And we've watched that not just, people always talk about it on the political spectrum, but we watch that from celebrities and all the things that we look at when it comes to the media. But ultimately, even when we're watching a television show and we're watching a film, the reason why most people want to get to that end of the film is they want the sense of justice. They want to feel that they've watched a film and the bad guy is going to get what he deserves and the good guy is going to get what they deserve. Because innately, I think as human beings, truth matters to us in a very deeply personal level. And that's something that I don't think gets actually discussed beyond, this conversation, really, if you think about it.
Yeah. So I know you believe that media literacy exists widely and deeply beyond facts and fact checking and so on and so forth. And what you just said speaks to that belief and idea as well. So I have only one more question for you, which is at a very practical level.
Sure.
What do you, your book is full of ideas from different kinds of media and information literacy. And that is fascinating. So I just wanted to find out, what are the new areas of that say students of media literacy, especially maybe at the college level, should invest in? What is it that media and information literacy provide and offer today in what seems to be an increasingly sophisticated and diverse kind of a field?
So I think actually that if I were to see where media literacy is going, I would say that it's not just within schools. I think this is a community piece. I think it's a business part. I've noticed now all of a sudden companies talk about having media literacy embedded in their code of ethics and so forth. And I think that really speaks to, where I think this is probably the benevolent side of me that wants, media literacy for everybody and the solutions part of it. But I think, more deeply, we live in a world where we have to have some kind of guidance, and the guide needs to be there from the beginning of life, as far as I'm concerned. And people have asked me in previous conversations, where should media literacy start? And I said to someone recently, it should be starting the minute a parent knows they're going to have a child. It should be in prenatal classes. And they laughed, and I said, I'm not kidding. I mean, the reality is that we are living in a technological society, and that's the society that will be with us forever on more. I still grew up without some of these tools. You did as well, but your students will probably have not. And in fact, we'll see technology grow and get faster and change and evolve to the point where there will be these ethical questions posed in front of them between, the human person and the technology and the melding of them together. Right. Are they wanting to step into that realm where human and technology becomes one? And so I guess that sort of puts me into this idea of techno-morality. And, we're going to be thinking about that for the future for ourselves. And also looking, more deeply into where AI is going, which I think also brings us back to techno-morality. How far are we going to want technology to control us, right, and us control it? And without having the human factor in play, I don't think we have media literacy. And so it's really important that that always be sort of at the forefront of thinking, whatever moves us forward. And it doesn't really matter to me what field you go into now, because whether it's science, whether it's math, whether it's business, education, you name it, we now need a media literate audience.
See, that sounds so heartening and optimistic for students who might be taking a course in media literacy out of interest, but might actually end up majoring in it or whatever, because the scope and the depth and the need for media literacy, even among corporates, as you said, and corporates who are grappling with this whole techno-morality themselves.
Right.
Might need media literacy graduates, certainly media literate graduates. But that brings us to the end of the interview, Belinha. Thank you so much for taking the time and for your wonderful insights.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it. Thank you.